Hey guys, it's the Muffin Man, but for this story, I'm gonna go by Jason. I can't use my real name or anyone else's because of the NDA we signed. Fucking thing was as thick as a phone book and almost scarier than anything we saw that night. I know I'm risking everything by spilling this, but it's been eating me up for a decade. People need to know what happened, just in case it's not over, because I'm not convinced it is. This all went down 10 years ago, back in 2015, at a rundown seafood warehouse tucked away in an industrial corner of Seattle, Washington, near the Puget Sound, where the air always smelled like salt and fish guts. The place was a maze of rusted metal, dripping pipes, and flickering fluorescent lights, but the job itself? It wasn't the worst. It was a paycheck, a way to chase that comma, those dollar signs that kept us grinding. The company wasn't some evil corporation, just another poorly run outfit with management that treated us like cogs in a machine. Most of the supervisors were power-tripping assholes who'd write you up for taking an extra 5 minutes on break. But there was one night manager, let's call him Ray, who was pretty cool. Ray was in his mid-40s, wiry, with a scruffy beard and a laugh that could cut through the warehouse's gloom. He'd join us for knife-throwing contests in the office on slow nights, pulling out this ridiculous foot-long Rambo-style knife with a serrated edge that he swore he'd bought at a survivalist expo. We'd pin up old delivery manifests on a corkboard and take turns chucking pocket knives at it, betting energy drinks or cigarettes on who'd hit the bullseye. Looking back, it was reckless as hell, knives flying in a cramped office with bad lighting, but it was our way of surviving the everyday bullshit. Me and my coworkers were local truck drivers, hauling seafood to restaurants and markets around Seattle. We worked the mid to graveyard shift, usually 4 p.m. to 4 a.m., sometimes later if the loads were delayed. The crew was a mix of rough-around-the-edges types, ex-cons trying to stay straight, single dads, and guys like me just scraping by. We made the best of it, turning the warehouse into our playground when the bosses weren't breathing down our necks. On quiet nights, we'd stage airsoft wars in the parking lot, using cheap pellet guns we'd bought at Walmart. We'd set up barriers with empty pallets and crates, ducking and weaving through the shadows, laughing like kids until a supervisor barked at us to get back to work. Other times, we'd mess around with dry ice from the packing stations, dropping chunks into empty water bottles with a splash of water to make makeshift bombs. They'd pop loud enough to echo across the lot, and we'd cackle like idiots while waiting for our trucks to be loaded with crates of salmon, crab, or whatever else was on the docket. It was dumb, dangerous stuff, but it kept us sane in a job that could grind your soul to dust. This story's about one night, though, one that turned our world upside down and still haunts me, waking me up in a cold sweat a decade later. I was training with my coworker, who I'll also call Jason since we shared the same name. J squared, we'd joke, fist-bumping like we were starring in our own buddy comedy. He was a buff guy, always quick with a joke, and always wearing a new mariner's cap pulled low. We were out on a delivery route, just another night hauling fish to a couple of high-end restaurants in Capitol Hill and a market in Ballard. The route was routine. Load the truck with crates, dodge Seattle's potholes, drop off the goods, and banter about nothing, sports, women, or which diner had the best late-night country fried steak. We left the warehouse around 8 p.m., expecting to be back by 2 or 3 a.m. But when we pulled back into the loading dock, everything had gone to hell. It started with a guy we'll call Mike, one of the warehouse grunts who worked the floor, sorting and packing seafood. Mike was in his early 30s, quiet but reliable, the kind of guy who'd show up, do his job, and never complain. He had this habit of chewing on toothpicks, always had one dangling from his mouth like he was auditioning for a cowboy movie. That night, he'd been assigned to the back of the warehouse, near the loading docks where the big walk-in freezers hum like angry beasts. The docks were a dark, chilly corner of the building, always damp from condensation, and littered with stray fish scales that stuck to your boots. Around midnight, word spread among the crew that something weird had happened. Some sketchy-looking dude. Nobody could say if he was a new hire, a temp, or just some homeless guy who'd slipped past the gate had attacked Mike while he was moving a stack of crab crates. This wasn't a scuffle. This guy had bitten Mike, sinking his teeth into Mike's forearm like a feral dog. Not a little nip either, a full-on chomp that tore through skin and muscle, blood pouring out like a busted pipe. Mike's scream was so loud it cut through the warehouse's usual din of forklifts and shouting. He dropped his crate, crab legs spilling across the floor, and collapsed, clutching his arm. Ray, the night manager, was on it in seconds, sprinting from the office with his Rambo knife still tucked in his belt. He found Mike slumped against a pallet, blood pooling under him, soaking into the cracked concrete. A couple of other workers helped drag Mike to the break room, a dingy space with a sagging couch, a vending machine that only dispensed off-brand soda, and a microwave that smelled like burnt fish. By the time they got him there, Mike was in bad shape. His face was pale as the underbelly of a cod, sweat pouring off him like he'd just run a marathon. He was mumbling nonsense, random words like cold and eyes that didn't string together into anything coherent. His arm was the worst part. The bite wound was swelling fast, the skin around it turning a sickly grayish green, like fish left too long in a broken cooler. The veins around the wound were darkening, spiderwebbing up his arm, and the smell, God, it was like rotting meat mixed with something chemical, sharp and wrong. Ray tried to bandage it with a first aid kit that was probably older than half the crew, but it didn't help. Mike's eyes kept rolling back, and his breathing was shallow, like he was drowning in his own body. The call to 911 was a desperate plea, but the dispatcher's voice crackled through the ancient break-room phone with the kind of detached calm that made your skin crawl. Paramedics are en route, but there's a multi-car pileup on I-5. It could be 20, maybe 30 minutes. Seattle traffic, always a nightmare, but tonight it felt like a death sentence. Ray, the night manager, knelt beside Mike, his Rambo knife glinting under the flickering fluorescent light as he tried to keep things under control. Two other guys, let's call them Tony and Luis, both burly warehouse vets who'd seen their share of fights, stood by, their faces pale as they watched Mike writhe on the sagging couch. The break room was a claustrophobic box, walls stained yellow from years of cigarette smoke and the microwave, disasters. The air was thick with the stench of fish, and now something worse, the rancid metallic tang of Mike's blood. They tried to keep him calm, but Mike was beyond reason. His breathing was ragged, each gasp sounding wet, like he was choking on something deep inside. His arm, where that freak had bitten him, was a grotesque mess. The skin around the wound had turned a putrid gray-green, puckered and weeping a thick blackish ooze that smelled like death itself. Dark veins pulsed under his skin, crawling up his arm like roots, and his eyes, his eyes, were starting to cloud over, like cataracts forming in real time. He mumbled feverish nonsense, words like hungry and dark, slurring together, his voice no longer human, but something guttural, primal. Ray barked at Tony to grab more gauze from the first aid kit, but it was useless. The bandages were soaked through in seconds, and Mike's body started convulsing, his limbs jerking like a puppet with cut strings. Then, maybe 20 minutes after the call, it happened. Mike went still. His chest stopped heaving, his eyes rolled back to show nothing but whites, and his jaw went slack, a thin line of drool mixed with blood dribbling down his chin. The room went silent, except for the hum of the vending machine and the distant clatter of the warehouse. Ray, Tony, and Louis froze, staring at Mike's lifeless body. "He's gone, man! He's fucking gone!" Louis said, his voice cracking. Tony, tougher than most, started CPR, pumping Mike's chest with a rhythm that echoed like a drum in the cramped space. But it was no use. He was dead. Then, Bam! Mike's body jolted upright, so fast it was like something had yanked him from the grave. Except it wasn't Mike anymore. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, his milky eyes locked onto Ray with a hunger that made your stomach twist. His skin was waxy, stretched tight over his skull, and his mouth hung open, revealing teeth stained red with his own blood. Before anyone could react, he lunged at Ray with a snarl that didn't sound human, like a wolf and a machine grinding together. His teeth sank into Ray's neck, tearing through flesh and muscle with a sickening rip. Blood sprayed across the break room walls, painting the faded safety posters and the vending machine in a crimson arc. Ray's scream was cut short, turning into a wet gurgle as he collapsed, clawing at Mike's face. Tony and Lewis stumbled back, shouting, "What the fuck?" But Mike, or whatever he'd become, was already on them. He moved fast, too fast, his limbs jerking in a way that defied physics, like a spider scuttling across a web. He tackled Tony, biting into his shoulder, and Lewis bolted for the door, only to trip over a chair and hit the floor hard. The screams, God, the screams, they echoed through the warehouse, a chorus of terror that drowned out the hum of the freezers and the clank of machinery. By the time Jason and I rolled back from our route around 3 a.m., the warehouse was a waking nightmare. We pulled our truck up to the loading dock, expecting to see the usual crew slacking off, maybe Ray tossing his knife or someone sneaking a smoke. Instead, a low, guttural moaning hit us before we even cut the engine. It wasn't one voice, it was dozens, layered into a sickening hum that vibrated in your bones. The air outside the warehouse was wrong, heavy with a stench like rotting meat and something sharper, almost chemical. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped out, our boots crunching on the gravel. The loading dock doors were half open, and the darkness inside seemed to pulse, like the warehouse itself was alive and breathing. "What in the hell is that?" Jason muttered, his hand already on his pistol that was tucked under his jacket. Company policy banned weapons, but Seattle's got its rough spots, and we weren't idiots. We both carried Glocks, mine a 9mm, his a .40, hidden under our coats, ready for anything. Or so we thought. We stepped inside, and the scene hit us like a punch to the gut. The warehouse was a slaughterhouse. 30 employees, every single one turned, shambled through the dim light, their flesh gray and peeling, their eyes empty white voids. Mike was there, his toothpick gone, his face smeared with blood and bits of what looked like skin. Ray, the night manager, was unrecognizable, his neck torn open, one arm dangling by a thread of sinew as he staggered toward us. The floor guys, the packers, even the janitor with his stupid bucket hat, all of them were walking dead, straight out of a horror flick. The warehouse floor was a slick, glistening mess of gore, fish guts from spilled crates mixing with blood and worse, creating a putrid sludge that squelched underfoot. Some of the creatures had chunks of flesh hanging from their mouths, their jaws working mindlessly, teeth grinding against bone. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the buzz of flies already swarming the carnage. The overhead lights flickered, casting shadows that made the zombies seem to flicker in and out of existence, their moans rising into a chorus that clawed at your sanity. We didn't hesitate. My gun was out in a heartbeat, the weight of it steadying my shaking hands. I aimed for the head, like you see in the movies, and squeezed the trigger. The first shot caught a guy from the packing line, some kid whose name I never learned, square in the forehead. His skull snapped back, and he crumpled, black ichor oozing from the hole. Jason followed, his .40 barking twice, dropping 2 more. A woman who worked the sorting line, and another guy whose face was too mangled to recognize. But there were too many, and they weren't slow like you'd expect. These fuckers moved with a jerky, unnatural speed, like their bodies were fighting against whatever was driving them. One lunged at me, its fingers curled into claws, nails crusted with blood. "Fuck you, you fucking fucks!" I screamed as I fired again, missing the head but hitting its chest, which did nothing but make it stumble for a second. Jason grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the loading dock. "Pallets!" he shouted, and we scrambled behind a stack of wooden crates, using them as a makeshift barricade. The zombies were closing in, their moans now mixed with wet, snapping sounds as they tore into anything in their path, each other, crates, even the metal railing along the dock. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, and the air felt too thick to breathe, like we were drowning in the warehouse's decay. We were alive, but we were trapped, and the nightmare was only beginning. "Jay, we gotta get to the office," I screamed, my voice cracking over the cacophony of guttural moans and the wet, tearing sounds of flesh being ripped apart. The office was our only shot, a small, reinforced room at the far end of the warehouse with a steel door and a landline that might still work. It was maybe 50 yards away, but it felt like a mile through the hellscape the warehouse had become. My heart pounded so hard, it felt like it was clawing its way out of my chest, each beat a deafening thud in my ears. Jason nodded, his face pale under his mariner's cap, his gun trembling in his hands but still aimed forward. We sprinted, our boots slipping on the slick, blood-soaked floor, the stench of gore and rotting fish so thick it coated my throat. The zombies, our coworkers, people we'd shared smokes and laughs with, were everywhere, their gray, peeling flesh glistening under the flickering fluorescent lights. Their milky eyes locked onto us, unblinking, driven by a hunger that twisted their faces into something monstrous. One of them, a guy from the loading crew named Eddie, lunged from behind a crate, his jaw unhinged, teeth snapping inches from my arm. I fired my gun, the 9mm report echoing like a thunderclap. The bullet punched through his forehead, and he collapsed, black ichor oozing from the wound. But more were coming, fast, jerky, like puppets jerked by invisible strings. Jason fired too. His .40 dropped two more. A woman whose name I couldn't remember, her face half chewed off, and another guy whose chest was a gaping, bloody cavity. We dropped maybe 6 or 7 in that mad dash, each shot a desperate prayer. But the horde kept closing in, their moans a bone-chilling chorus that seemed to vibrate through the warehouse's metal walls. We reached the office, a squat concrete box with a heavy steel door that looked like it could stop a tank. I slammed it shut behind us, the clang reverberating as I fumbled with the lock. Jason shoved a metal desk against the door, its legs screeching across the linoleum floor, while I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the handle for good measure. "What in the actual fuck?" Jason murmured. The zombies were right behind us, their fists, or what was left of them, pounding against the door with a relentless hollow thud. The sound wasn't human. It was like the warehouse itself was trying to break in, each impact sending dust trickling from the ceiling. Their moans seeped through the walls, a low, guttural drone that clawed at my sanity, punctuated by the occasional wet snarl or a scream that cut off too quickly. I could see their shadows moving under the door's crack, jerky and wrong, and the air grew heavy with the reek of decay, like we were trapped in a tomb. Jason was shaking, his Glocks still raised, his knuckles white around the grip. "They're not stopping, man," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding. His eyes were wide, darting to the door, and I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, mixing with the grime and blood splattered on his face from our sprint. I lunged for the phone on the desk, an old rotary model coated in dust and coffee stains. My hands were slick with sweat, fumbling the receiver as I dialed 911. When the dispatcher picked up, I was screaming before she could even ask what was wrong. "We're under attack! They're eating people! The whole warehouse! Everyone's turned into monsters!" The words tumbled out, incoherent. But how do you explain that your coworkers have become flesh-eating abominations?
The dispatcher's voice was calm, infuriatingly so, saying units were on the way but delayed by a pileup on I-5. I slammed the phone down, my chest heaving, and looked at Jason. "We're on our own," I said, and the words felt like a death sentence. The pounding on the door grew louder, the steel groaning under the weight of bodies pressing against it. I swear I heard the crack of bone as one of them smashed its hand or head against the metal, and a smear of dark, viscous fluid started seeping under the door, pooling like oil on the floor. 15 agonizing minutes later, we heard sirens. Cops, not paramedics. The relief was short-lived. Through the office's small, reinforced window, we saw 2 patrol cars screech into the parking lot, their red and blue lights cutting through the pre-dawn fog. 4 officers jumped out, guns drawn, shouting commands that were swallowed by the warehouse's chaos. They didn't know what they were walking into. We heard their shouts turn to screams, followed by gunfire, sharp, panicked bursts that echoed through the loading dock. Then, silence, broken only by the wet, ripping sounds of the zombies feeding. Jason pressed his face to the window, his breath fogging the glass. "They're gone," he whispered, his voice hollow. I didn't look. I didn't need to. The screams had painted a vivid enough picture, and the thought of those cops, regular guys just doing their job, being torn apart made my stomach lurch. An hour later, the atmosphere shifted. The moans outside grew quieter, replaced by the low rumble of engines and the sharp crack of suppressed gunfire. I risked a glance through the window and saw them, black SUVs, unmarked, rolling into the lot like a military convoy. Men in tactical gear poured out, moving with a precision that screamed training, their rifles fitted with suppressors that made each shot a muffled pop. They swept through the warehouse, headshots only, dropping the zombies with a cold efficiency that was almost more terrifying than the creatures themselves. Behind them were a few suits, men and women in crisp black attire, their faces unreadable, like they'd seen this horror show before, and it was just another Tuesday. By dawn, the warehouse was silent, but the air was thick with the stench of death, blood, decay, and something chemical that burned my nostrils. The floor was a carpet of bodies, some still twitching, their gray flesh pooling with black ichor that seemed to eat into the concrete. We told them everything we knew, the info that we gathered from skimming through what was on the surveillance cameras. Mike's bite, the chaos, how we survived by sheer dumb luck and our pistols. They didn't react, just scribbled notes on clipboards, their faces betraying nothing. One of them, a woman with a scar across her cheek, kept glancing at a tablet, like she was cross-referencing our story with something else. They didn't answer our questions, didn't explain a damn thing. The next day, a government lawyer showed up at a nondescript motel where they'd stashed us, shoving NDAs in our faces along with settlement checks so fat they could choke a horse. Life-changing money, the kind that buys silence and a new start far from Seattle. They called it a chemical spill, causing a mass hallucination. Bullshit. We saw what we saw. Our friends turned into monsters, tearing each other apart. They cleaned the warehouse overnight, scrubbed it so thoroughly it was like nothing ever happened. The company shut down a month later, the building left to rot, and not a single news outlet touched the story. A perfect cover-up. I don't know what that biter was or where it came from. Maybe a lab experiment gone wrong? Maybe something older, darker, that the suits knew about and we didn't. All I know is Jason and I survived, but the nightmares don't stop. I'm breaking the NDA because people need to know something's out there and it could happen again. If you're working a dead-end night shift, keep your eyes open, watch the shadows, and for God's sake, carry some form of protection, just in case. Signed, Jason, the Muffin Man.